Hi everybody, this is Alex Garris from Skeptiko.com. Just wanted to let you know that I recently published an interview with Dr. Julie Beischel about her new research into assisted after-death communication. In other words, talking to mediums. So if you want to check it out, it's on the Skeptiko website. You can listen to the full interview. I'll have it here as a YouTube. You can listen to it here if you want as well. Dr. Julie Beischel, if you don't know, is a PhD in pharmacology and toxicology. She really knows what she's doing. She can really put together tightly controlled experiments, and that's what she's done here. Kind of is the final nail in the coffin, no pun intended, in terms of whether or not medium communication is real. It definitely is real, according to her research. She now has a total of 74 readings under more than double-blind conditions. It's just really impressive stuff. Handles all the cold reading objections and all the other really silliness that skeptics make about this research. Check it out. Here is the full interview with Dr. Julie Beischel.
On this episode of Skeptiko.
Psychic mediums? Is this some kind of joke? I mean, research and science doesn't go with the term medium communication, does it?
So science is just a tool. It's just one way we learn how the universe works. And so it can be applied to anything. And there was a lot of people with strong opinions about what the capacity of mediums is. Can they report accurate and specific information? And so I took the scientific method and I applied it to mediumship, which again is just a tool you can apply to anything. And so, no, yeah, it does go together because it's something we don't fully understand yet. So yeah, it's the perfect thing for science to tackle.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Garris, and on this episode of Skeptiko, as you may have just heard, medium communication research. You know, this is a topic that we've touched on a couple of times in the show, and I have to tell you, when I got this latest email from Dr. Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Institute, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, wow, do we really need to cover this again? And it's funny because as I got into this show, I realized how central this topic is to everything we're talking about. And in a lot of ways that I guess were surprising to me. One little tidbit I'll give you is just the extent to which the therapy community around the topic of grief has totally moved away from this materialistic, reductionistic biological robot meme that we always talk about on this show. So it's buried in this interview, but I want you to pull that out. And when Julie says that, hey, you know, in therapy, they don't even ascribe to the idea that grief is this brain-based physiological thing, that's out the window because they've just empirically proven that just doesn't work as a therapeutic model. Forget it. It's gone. And where they've gone is to this continuing bonds model, which is very intriguing because, of course, it plays in perfectly with what Julie has discovered, even though the therapeutic community wasn't anticipating this afterlife communication or anything like that. They were just following the data, if you will. So that's one little tidbit from this interview. There's a lot of other little points in here that I think are interesting. One, of course, is obviously that she's, again, replicated this research, tightest controls, can't get past the data. Everyone will step past the data. But assisted after-death communication is a reality. We have to face it. We have to deal with what that means. That's established. And there's other interesting bits about the physiological effects of being a medium. We touch on that. And I think you're going to want to listen to this very important announcement that she has on a conference that's coming up about this subject. And I want you to know that the conference may have passed already, but you can still go online and watch the videos. And it sounds like it was a great conference and with some great presenters, and I think there's probably tremendous stuff there. I haven't had a chance to go and check it all out yet, but I will, and I encourage you to as well, and I'll have a link to that in the notes. Okay, so I'm going to play this interview. I'm also going to play a little bit of the pre-interview chat that we had, just because I think it's kind of interesting and lets you know what I'm doing kind of with the show and where I'm heading. And so there's 5 or 6 minutes of that you might have to endure. You can skip past it if you want. So here's my interview with Dr. Julie Beischel. Well, let's jump into this. I have a different format, and I have to tell you, you're somewhat of the guinea pig for this.
Bring it.
No, what I'm trying to do is trying to just gain a little bit more traction. I mean, the podcast is great and it reaches thousands of people, but there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people that it doesn't reach. So I'm trying to kind of also do more of website, Upworthy, shareability, BuzzFeed kind of format too, just to kind of reach more people. Because I think one of the problems that we all run into in this field, including, a lot of the people that you run in circles with, that's not really not the way I meant to say that, but, in the circles you run in, is a little bit of groupthink. You know what I mean? A little bit of, oh my gosh, we're changing the world. Oh my gosh, there's paradigm shift it's like, no, it's not. No, most people are still unaware of this. I mean, take your stuff, for example. I mean, most people are completely unaware of what you've done.
Yeah,
so,
and how common these experiences are.
But it's easy to sit back and go, wow. And I hear this all the time. People go, oh, the medium thing. I mean, that's done now. We all know that's real, I mean, we got the TV shows, we have the movies, we have, it's such a popular part of media. And I go, yeah, but when you really sit down and talk to somebody, they have serious doubts about there being any science behind it.
Yeah, I was surprising. I thought you were going to go the other way. Like, oh, people know that they're all frauds. That's what I hear. Oh, yeah. We already know that it's totally been disproven. And so it's I think probably people are in one of two camps. Like, oh, of course it's been proven. And they really believe that it's true. Or, oh no, it's been dismissed and discounted as fraudulent.
I think they're in limbo. That's right. I think where people really are is in limbo. They're in this state of constant confusion that we all are, which is, on one hand, I hear that this stuff is real, when I see the movies and I see the TV shows. And on the other hand, I have this vague sense that the serious scientific folks are saying that, no, don't look there. So I'm kind of in limbo. I don't know which way to jump thing. And I think they just sit there in limbo. And that's where I just think we need to just pound away at the same old thing, which is what, some people like Dr. Beischel here have really tried to take a serious look at it. And here's what they found out. And, there you go.
Yeah. And I think people are getting conflicting information from other non-scientific sources like religion. Like I had this experience where I was speaking at one of our mediums invited me to speak at the psychic fair in Cincinnati, and it's huge. They do it twice a year. It's at the convention center. It's huge, and my aunts live in Cincinnati, and so they were going to come and hear me talk. And it was on a Sunday, and they went to church that morning. My extended family is very Catholic, and my aunt was telling me that after church, she was talking to her friend, and her friend said, "Oh, what are you going to do today?" And she said, "Oh, my niece is speaking at this psychic fair about her research with mediums." And her friend sort of just stopped and tilted her head and said, I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. And this was a grown woman, but there's this idea that these, we were saying, some people think it's fraudulent, some people think it's proven, some people think it's evil.
Totally.
So yeah, there's just really a lot of misinformation from a lot of different sources and that people have to juggle.
Hey, that's no misinformation, honey. I mean, the Bible tells us straight out, this stuff is, from the devil. You are forced, therefore, to kind of jump on one side or the other. And you do. I mean, I have to have a little bit of empathy for the atheists who I'm always on this show just kind of pillaring. But on one hand, I mean, there's still just a lot of really crazy, confusing ideas out there that need to be dispelled about religion. And I mean, if you dive into it, because what I just said, of course, is contradicted by a lot of religious scholars who go in and say, well, gee, that's not really the way that it was or understood, or that even if you are Christian, you can find all these accounts of people in the Bible who we're supposed to respect doing this kind of stuff. But let's leave all that aside because the Bible is a crock, as we know historically. But still, that's a lot for people to sort through and kind of shift through in terms of overturning their belief systems and all the rest of that.
Especially if it's from when you were a child.
Absolutely.
It's just understood. You don't even question it.
Absolutely. Okay, now that was all pre-interview talk, but do you mind if I use some of this and put
Not
it
at
out there?
all.
Okay. Before becoming the preeminent researcher of medium communication, or as she likes to call it, hypothesized anomalous information reception, Dr. Julie Beischel was a newly minted PhD in pharmacology and toxicology who was trying to come to grips with the loss of her mother. Grief had led Dr. Beischel to the door of Dr. Gary Schwartz, whose controversial research into medium communication had drawn national attention. After several years of collaboration, during which Dr. Beischel designed and implemented experiments which have become widely recognized as setting the gold standard in such research, Julie left the University of Arizona to found the Windbridge Institute. Her research into medium communication and its effect on the bereaved continues to shed light on this phenomena that redefines who we are and ever so directly flies in the face of what science is telling us about life and death. Okay, Julie, you had to endure my kind of written, prepared introduction, but with that, welcome back, I should say. It's great to have you on Skeptiko.
Thanks so much for having me back. I'm pleased to be here.
So there is so much that we can talk about, but I really want to try and bring us into alignment or focus on some fantastic research papers that you've put out that really expand this whole area in some new areas that are very, very exciting. Let's dig into the first one here that you sent me. Julie, you're one of the most renowned and deservedly respected researchers of this medium communication phenomena. And as I just mentioned, you've set the gold standard for this kind of research, what a lot of scholars point to and say, this is really the way to do this research. But given this paper that you've just given me, I still have to ask the question that I'm sure many ask when they run into it is, are you kidding? You're researching psychic mediums? Is this some kind of joke? I mean, research and science doesn't go with the term medium communication, does it?
So science is just a tool. It's just one way we learn how the universe works. And so it can be applied to anything. And there was a lot of people with strong opinions about what the capacity of mediums is. Can they report accurate and specific information? And so I took the scientific method and I applied it to mediumship, which again is just a tool you can apply to anything. And so, it does go together because it's something we don't fully understand yet. So it's the perfect thing for science to tackle because we don't understand it.
You've spent a lot of time actually investigating whether or not the information that mediums give their clients is accurate, which of course would be the first thing that we would have to start with in terms of this phenomena. Now we're going to talk about in a minute this latest research project you've done, which extends that much, much further. But I think the bedrock, of course, is there really a phenomena here to study? Can you give folks just a brief summary of what you've done to find out whether this phenomena is really happening and kind of summarize those results? And then later we can talk about this most recent research paper, the other one that you did to further extend and verify what you found out before. But maybe first off, just kind of this high level picture of how you went about finding out whether this stuff really happens.
So in order to investigate mediumship, an experiment really needs to have two important factors. One, an experimental environment that best mimics the way mediumship exists in nature. So you need an optimal research environment, and then you also need maximum controls. So you need to eliminate all sensory explanations, all normal explanations for how a medium could be getting her information. So we do that. Our readings take place over the phone, which a lot of mediums are used to doing readings over the phone. I, as the experimenter, serve as the proxy in place of the absent sitter who doesn't know the reading is taking place. And then there's maximum control. So I'm blinded. I don't have any information about the sitter or the discarnate, which is what we call the deceased person. The medium is blinded. She doesn't have anything either. So she can't Google someone and look them up. And, so we've started to address fraud because we can't look anything up. That addresses as well experimenter cueing, because I can't even inadvertently sort of steer her as she's giving the reading because I don't have any information. So I'm blinded, she's blinded. During scoring, the sitter scores two different readings, two transcripts of two readings that they didn't hear. One is theirs, which we call the target reading, and one is someone else's, that the same medium did a reading for someone else. That's called a decoy reading. And then then there's two other experimenters as part of the procedure who are blinded to different pieces of information, which medium's doing which readings, which one is for which discarnate, etc. So there's 5 levels of blinding, which is why we previously called it quintuple blinded. Now we're just using the term more than double blinded. So the medium is blinded, the sitter is blinded, and all the experimenters are blinded. So it's more than double blind. And that protocol controls for, like I said, fraud, cold reading, which is the medium, fraudulent mediums using cues from the sitter or even things the sitter just tells her to sort of fabricate what seems to the sitter to be an accurate reading, but really is just the medium being a good sociologist and reading cues and spitting it back to the person. And then they, people really want to hear from their deceased loved one, so they'll sort of turn it into, oh yeah, I did experience communication, even though it didn't actually happen. And so this protocol also controls for what's called rater bias. If you know it's your reading when you do the scoring, you'll have the tendency to score more things as correct because you want it to be correct. So with our protocol where the sitter receives 2 readings and only one of them is theirs and they're blinded, there's no way to tell which one was intended for you. It sort of equalizes rater bias across the board. And then we just compare scores given to target readings to the scores given to decoy readings. And we look at scoring in 3 different ways. 1, the sitter score each individual item in the reading. 2, they give each whole reading a global score. And 3, they choose which reading they think is more applicable to them. So that's called binary forced choice. So we say there's 2, you have to pick one. And so that's the statistics are all relatively straightforward in how those things are analyzed. And so what we found is in all 3 of those ways that we look at scoring that we've achieved statistically significant positive results in a study done in 2007 and then a replication study that we just published earlier in 2015. So the original study was 16 readings, and this most recent study is 58. So that's a total of 74 readings in which, under these more than double blind conditions, that demonstrated that mediums could report accurate and specific information about the deceased when no sensory explanations could be plausible for where they could have got their information.
Right. I mean, what other explanation is plausible? And I always think it's interesting when I hear people who are completely uneducated about the science behind this to kind of throw stones at it. And I'm going like, well, how would you do it any better? How would you tighten up the protocol? Why does it need to be programmed? And they just don't know because they haven't really looked at the research. But, the other thing I wanted to add that I think you might want to kind of elaborate on, because I think it's so important to understanding this science and how this science gets done. Or maybe the question is, why so little of this science gets done? Because I think inevitably people will look at it and go, 12 cases, who cares? Oh, you followed it up with 58 cases. Oh, you're so proud of that, Julie. What's the big deal? Well, give people a sense for what it takes to do this to the level of, I guess, control and careful scientific work that you're doing. It's a major undertaking, right?
Oh yeah, I've been doing this full time now for 10 years. And the team that we work with a team of mediums on our research team called Winbridge Certified Research Mediums. They've gone through an extensive 8-step screening, training, testing procedure. And we were able to acquire that team through a grant. And we figured it out. We're not screening mediums anymore. We figured it out that it costs about $7,000 to $10,000 per medium to screen, because you have to train them, and you have to get 2 sitters, and you have to screen 4 to 7 sitters in order to get a pair of sitters for one medium to read, and they have to go through 2 different phases of testing and for the test readings, and it's just an excessive amount of time and work to even put the team together. And then now you have to do the studies on top of that. So yeah, it's not like you can just grab some people and go, hey, read these people, tell me about their dead person. It's very complicated, the screening of the mediums, the screening of the sitters, and the training of sitters on how to do the scoring. And then about 25% of sitters don't ever return their scores to us. So now we've put in, the research team and the medium have put in all the time, and then we don't have any data to show for it. And so that's very frustrating, because the people that are signing up, I think, to receive readings through research are people who want a free mediumship reading, not necessarily people who want to move forward the science. They don't really care about that. They just want a free mediumship reading. So when it isn't because it's under these quintuple blind conditions, it's not a reading like you'd get if you were, on the phone with the medium yourself. It's not as easy for her to do what she does. And so it's not like the wow that people are expecting, I think. And so a lot of people they can't be bothered with providing us with the data that they agreed to. And so that's super frustrating. But yeah, we would be very happy. Like, this is a replication study, this most recent one, of a previously published study, right? Because in science, it doesn't happen until it happens twice. And we would be very happy if somebody else took this protocol. It's laid out, it's all done, and replicated it with other mediums in another lab. That would be wonderful.
Great. So then let's talk about some of your more recent research, because what you've done that's just amazingly fascinating is every time you go into a new area, I'm like, wow, I never thought of that, but that's such an important question to ask. And one of the questions that you seem to be asking with this latest round of research is, what is the effect of all this on the mediums? And you seem to be looking at the psychophysiological effects and finding out that mediums have some different health issues than non-mediums do. Can you tell us briefly what that research is all about and what you've discovered?
I recently presented some results from this study at the Society for Scientific Exploration meeting. And what we were seeing was, just anecdotally, the mediums on our team were reporting a lot of health issues. And so we thought, well, maybe there's something about performing a mediumship reading that has some negative effect on the body. Maybe you get pumped full of cortisol. Maybe you have a lot of adrenaline, whatever. So we thought, well, we'll just do, we're not sure what we're looking for because we don't know what it is. We'll just sort of do a shotgun approach, and we'll look at basic physiological measures, heart rate, blood pressure, that sort of thing.
And let me just interject, because again, when we get into these things, we have to take a big step back and say, this would be unexplainable really from a scientific standpoint, unless I guess you said that these people were somehow convincing themselves and that somehow had some harmful placebo effect, negative nocebo effect on them. But there really isn't any reason that this group or population should have any physiological differences. Or maybe I'm jumping ahead. Maybe that's not really an issue, or is it?
Well, we're not the first people to notice that. There's a researcher that worked with some French mediums in the 60s, and he was reporting seeing a lot of different sort of diseases and health complaints in that population. And it's not uncommon I think that mediums just in their own community recognize that as an issue, that there are a lot of health problems. So we wanted to look at it. What might be causing it? So we looked at all these physiological parameters, and I think 28 different blood factors. So we took their blood. So yeah, the mediums are on our team are really great. They literally let me stab them with needles, in the for the sake of science. And so we took blood before and after mediumship reading and control condition, and we looked at all these different things. And the interesting piece was we didn't find anything. Nothing was changed. Their blood pressure didn't even go up. My husband, who was taking all the physiology measurements, my husband and research partner, Mark Bacuzzi, he was saying I could have like a negative conversation with them and see a bigger physiological change. I could have them describe a crappy situation of their past. We would see a spike of something, and we didn't see anything. And so that made me think, well, what's going on here? And so
because let me just interject. So that would kind of answer the first hypothesis that you would have. I mean, first you have to accept that this thing really happens, this anomalous communication really happens. You've already established for us that your research says that it does. And then your next hypothesis might be, the first one people would come across is, the process of doing a medium reading, screws up these people in a physiological way that we can measure. So that's what you sought out to answer first. And the answer was no, there's no measurable change that happens while they're doing their medium reading. Do I have that right?
Yeah. And again, there's limitations. It's the first time we've done anything. So it's just a pilot study. And so we only had 5 participants. They only did 1 reading. Maybe it doesn't have an effect until they do 6 readings in a day. And maybe it's cumulative, maybe it doesn't happen. But the fact that we didn't see anything, nothing increased, again, not blood pressure, not heart rate, not body temperature, nothing. And none of these, we looked at neurotransmitters and epinephrine and norepinephrine and dopamine, and nothing changed. And cortisol, and erythrocyte sedimentation rate, SED rate, which is sort of gives you a sense of overall inflammatory state of the body, and nothing was happening. So that made me think, well, maybe it's not the actual process of doing a reading that's the causing disease in these people. And I did give them a health survey, and they do report primarily more autoimmune disorders. So 16 of the mediums took this health survey, and 13 of them reported autoimmune disorders. And so if you just picked 16 women off the street of the same age, that would be statistically almost impossible that 13 of them would have autoimmune disorders. So that's very interesting. And the same thing with migraines. The female population of mediums report a lot more than should be in this population of migraines. And so I started to look into that, and my current hypothesis is, and this is, I'm not the first person to say this, is that they also have a lot of childhood trauma. And there's a very clear association in mainstream research between childhood abuse and trauma and adult disease, including autoimmune disorders and migraines, and among a million other things. So I surveyed them about child abuse, and they also sort of scored off the charts in traumatic experiences in childhood. So my current theory is that it's not mediumship that causes disease, but it's that trauma causes disease and mediumship. And again, that's been hypothesized before, that having trauma in your childhood makes you need psychic abilities, because you don't know where danger's coming from or when it's coming, and so you need to learn to have access to more non-local information, be able to sort of see things in the future, or know how people are feeling, and so you get more in touch with those other abilities. And so right now we've sort of just finished that study, and I'm in the process of getting the medium's feedback about what they think. Is that's not surprising to them, that I'm making this connection between abuse and mediumship and disease. So again, more research needs to take place. The study that we're doing, a 2-year study that just started at the beginning of July, and it's a development and implementation of a grand survey of American mediums. Just anyone who considers themselves a medium we want to fill out our survey once we develop it, and to see if these sort of trends in disease and trauma exist in the larger population.
Great stuff. Because I want to switch over to this other great study that you did, and I love this continuing bonds perspective and the paradigm shift that is implied by that. I think it's just so preciously skeptical all over it, So let me kind of lead into that, and let's talk about folks who are listening. This is a paper. Where is this paper being published? The Possible Effects of Bereavement of Assisted After-Death Communication During Readings with Psychic Mediums, a Continuing Bond Perspective. Where is this published, Julie?
This journal article was published in in Omega, the Journal of Death and Dying.
Awesome. Here is my canned question, if you will, Julie. Look, Julie, if you've lost a loved one, you're going to grieve. You're going to grieve for a long time. It's probably going to have severe mental and physical health consequences, but that's all we can do. You've lost them forever. You just have to deal with it. I mean, science has told us conclusively over and over again that we are physical beings, that we're essentially biological robots. When our brain dies, our mind dies, nothing remains. So don't we just have to get over it? Why would we want to think why might we even begin to think otherwise in dealing with this kind of loss?
It's actually not the viewpoint of the mental health community. So, like throughout the 50s, that was the understanding. The grief was almost pathological, and you best just get over it. You best accept that the person is gone and move on. And then starting in the 80s, the clinical community was like, yeah, that's not helping people. And most people can get through grief. Grief is a totally natural process. It's normal for humans and animals. And most people, like 85% of people, can get through it with their own resources that they have. But 15% of the time it can turn into what's called traumatic or prolonged grief, which can result in physical problems even, like we were saying before, that mental issues can have physical disease effects. So in the 80s, this new model of grief was developed called continuing bonds. And that model is not that you have to accept the loss and that the person is gone, but that you have to just change your definition of the relationship. So it's changing it from that the person is that you have a physical bond to the person, they're physically present, to that you have a spiritual bond, they're spiritually present. And they equate it to like when babies are developing, they need to see the mommy at all times. And then if the mommy leaves the room, they cry and they freak out. But there comes a point in their development where when the mommy leaves the room, they know the mommy still exists. She's just in the other room. So that's sort of that in childhood development, that's sort of the continuing bonds. So just like that, when someone dies, we just have to know that we can't see them and they're not physically here. They're still in our life and we still have a relationship with them. And so that's the continuing bonds model, which is the current sort of model of grief that the clinical community uses.
But your research is taking that in a whole different direction, because when you link up with the fact that psychologists and caregivers, people who deal with the grieving, have made the leap to say pragmatically, practically, we might want to seek this other path. There's really been no scientific basis for taking that path other than to say, let's just choose this set of beliefs, this set of delusional thinking over our solid evidence that really isn't so. But what you seem to be doing when you link it up to your research is say, hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's some reason to actually put some serious scientific weight into this continued bond idea, right?
Well, I'm not the first one to make that leap. There's been a lot of research examining the relationship between spontaneous after-death communication and bereavement and the process of grief. So there's been plenty of research demonstrating that when people have spontaneous experiences of their deceased loved one, that it improves their grief process. And so the leap that I'm making is, well, when you communicate with your deceased loved one through a mediumship reading, which we call assisted after-death communication, that should have the same effects as spontaneous after-death communication, which has been demonstrated to greatly improve grief. So that's the step that I'm taking, and now we just need to do the research that demonstrates that. We did a pilot exploratory study where we surveyed people about their recollections of their experiences of grief before and after reading, and they reported that it did improve their grief. And anecdotally, that's what we're hearing, and there's a lot of people in the world right now using it as sort of a self-prescribed treatment option when they're having trouble dealing with their grief, to go to a medium. So the next step is, my background is in pharmacology, and so I know how to design a drug trial. So I designed a drug trial, except instead of a drug, it's a mediumship reading. And so it's a clinical trial in which people receive a mediumship reading or are in a waitlist control group. And we look using standardized instruments, questionnaires, their level of grief before and after a reading versus the control waitlist group. So we'll see. And that's just the first step in the research. It might be that there are only certain kinds of grief or only certain kinds of loss or only certain kinds of people that can benefit from a mediumship reading, but we need to do the research to figure that out. It might not be beneficial to everybody. And we need to figure out who it's good for and when, and all of the questions that come next. If it is, we still have to demonstrate it is beneficial even to a portion of the population.
Awesome. So rather than making some more advanced depleted uranium bombs, maybe we should put a few $1 million behind this research, and we can generate 50 or 20 PhD papers out of what you just outlined. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done there, but as the research questions that you just rolled off the top of your head are just tremendously important to so many people. It's just stunning that this kind of research doesn't get done and that you have to work so hard to advance these pilot studies.
Well, the other piece of it is that the different meta-analyses and the research have shown that traditional grief counseling is no better for people often than the passage of time. Everybody gets better in a grief study because time has passed. Everybody improves in a grief study just because the passage of time has occurred. But research has shown that traditional psychotherapy doesn't really help grief, which would make sense because our understanding of how grief works in under this continuing bonds paradigm is that you have to demonstrate that your bond with the person continues even though they're dead. How could a counselor possibly make that happen? The way especially a counselor that's been indoctrinated in a system that completely denies the existence of a mind as anything other than an illusion of consciousness. And certainly there's therapists that don't militantly hold to that line, but when they don't, they're really overturning their education for the most part that did indoctrinate him in that way. So I think it's only natural that even if they're open to that, it has to create a certain dissonance with them in terms of the way they were brought up and the way they were educated with what they're saying. Yeah, our opinion is nobody wants us to do this clinical trial because if we don't show anything, the mediums are going to be mad. If we do show something, the clinicians are going to be mad. So nobody wants this study to take place. That's our opinion. I have no data to support that hypothesis. But that's what people are finding that in this research that I did for this article, that's what researchers are finding is that people are having bad experiences with clinicians who aren't validating their experiences as real. And even in our questionnaire study, our survey study, we asked people, we asked 83 people about their experiences with grief before and after mediumship reading, and a subset of them, 29, had also gone to a mental health professional. And we asked them about their experiences there as well. And I remember one of the comments was when my initial clinician didn't validate the experience that I'd had and my need to see a medium, I went and found someone who did. And so people, that's what creates a threshold in healthcare is that the patients are demanding that people be knowledgeable. And that's the call to action that I brought forth in this paper was people are getting readings and clinicians need to be aware of the reality of mediumship, not just what they're seeing portrayed on TV, which is not actual mediumship, how it exists in the real world.
I want to switch gears now and talk about this next paper that you sent me, Anomalous Information Reception by Research Mediums Under Blinded Conditions, number 2, the return of sequel replication and extension. So this is, as it said, a replication and extension of your earlier work. And I want you to tell folks a little bit about what you've done, why you had...
We already talked about this. I already talked about this.
You did, but...
You want it twice and you can pick?
Yeah, I want to... let me see if I can tee it up a tiny bit differently, and then I'll just kind of cut and paste it a little bit. But
and the other thing that we should talk about in this paper is this criticism about the names, because that's your community is big on that, so we should make sure we talk about that. Giving the mediums the names.
Talk about it now. Tell me what you think. Because we actually did a little. I don't want to say study. What would we say? A little demonstration, and that's one of the problems we ran into. So I think what you're alluding to is whenever you do these experiments, the one bit of information you give the medium is a name. And it turns out you got to be careful with those names because they can tie back to age or have a strong correlation with someone's age. If I say Betsy, then I'm probably dealing with someone who's older. That's not a very common name versus...
I don't know. My best friend in junior high was named Betsy. I think it depends. And let's talk about it. The names that we use, I looked up. The theory is that you can know a lot about people just by the name. And so I looked at some of the names that we were using in this study, and they included, I have a list here, James, Michael, Linda, Barbara, Matthew, Margaret, and John. And all of those names have been in the top 1,000 baby names since 1880, which is when they first started looking at that. So there's no way to tell, because they're just ubiquitous, these names, they're just names a lot of people have. And you can't really tell when they reach the height of their popularity. Like you could, names like Brittany and Mildred, you have, the probability of what age that person is. You can maybe get a little information, but the names aren't names like that. They're these very common names that have been popular since 1880. And the other piece is that we're asking very specific questions during the reading. So we give the medium the name, and then we ask them to describe the physical description of the person, describe their personality, what were their hobbies or interests, what was their cause of death, and what specific messages do they have for the absent sitter. And so with those names, like to be able to describe something meaningful about their relationship, like that last question in and of itself, how are you going to know what Betsy has to say to her deceased or to her living loved one? And that's the other piece too, is that these people could have died at any age. So like, if there's like someone named John, that could be like a 10-year-old John that died in 1960, and it could be like an 80-year-old John that died 2 years ago. And so it can't tell. And this, I don't know what demonstration you did, but we all have mediumistic ability. So to give quote unquote non-mediums these names and say, answer these questions about this person, they could be using mediumship ability to get the information from the actual Betsy or the actual John.
Yeah, it's like prayer research, right? I mean, what's your control group?
Exactly.
Find somebody who isn't being prayed for,
Right, who people don't wish good things for.
Yeah. Exactly. Right.
So you can't really control for it, and these names are very ubiquitous. And right, if you get the name John, like, are you describing John McCain or John Lennon? Like, those are very different. And the other name that
or John out of the Bible, John, one of the disciples of Jesus, right?
Right, or like Charles Barkley, Charles Manson, Prince Charles.
Yeah.
And the other one I use, George. There's so many Georges of all different races and ages, and none of these people are dead, but George Clinton, George Hamilton, George Carlin, George Strait, George Bush, either one, George Norrie, George Foreman, George Washington. All you have is the name George. And now you have to describe personality, physical description, hobbies, cause of death, messages for the sitter, and you and 19 of your friends have to do that to a statistically significant degree 58 times.
And that gets to the real question, I guess, implied in this whole thing that we kind of dance around with, and that's that why isn't this research more widely accepted? So you're doing, research experiment number 2, you're trying to get people to jump on the bandwagon, as you just described, and said, here, I've laid it all out, go replicate it. But there is this underlying resistance to it because it is so threatening to science as we know it. So, what is the answer? Your answer seems to be more good research and that science will prevail. But do you really think that's the way this thing plays out? Is anyone in the scientific quote unquote community going to roll over and say, well, there it is?
You know what? I don't care, because this is a replication study. We've showed it that it occurs twice now in 2 different populations of mediums. And, we're the Winbridge Institute for Applied Research. At the end of the day, we care about how this affects people's daily lives. And we've talked about grief and the possible effect of mediumship readings on the bereaved. And this research demonstrates that it's possible that they're not just doing cold reading, that it's not just reader bias, that they're not engaged in fraud. So something's happening and people are engaged in it and it's making them feel better. So let's tackle that. Let's go down that road. That's the important piece as a scientific community and as a society that we need to be following.
As the final thing that we might want to talk about, please tell folks what's going on with this conference that you sent me the link to, the Final Transition Conference, kind of an interesting name, Science, Death, and Consciousness, right there in your hometown of Tucson. Tell folks about that.
I'm so excited to be part of this conference. It's the first time they're hoping to annually do this same conference, the Final Transition.
Are we sure it's the Final Transition? I don't know about that title, but let's run with it. That's the title of the...
Right. Like, are there more transitions in the afterlife? We don't know. Right. It's in our current understanding, perhaps it's final, but it might not be. So they're doing a different take on it that I've never seen before, and I'm so excited to be part of it, where she sent out a press release today, the Lynn, the woman who's organizing it, and she was calling when parents and children sit down to have the talk, it's not about sex anymore, it's about death, and they're both adults. And so, with the baby boomer generation starting to die off, more and more people are getting faced with death and dying, and it's sort of bubbling up to the surface, like, we have to talk about it now. We can't push it under anymore. We have to talk about it. And this conference is bringing together, a lot of times I talk at a conference, it's me and the same 5 people, we're saying the same things. And this is a different group. It's healthcare providers, doctors and nurses and hospice clinicians, talking about the process of death and dying and what we need to know. And then it transitions, no pun intended, into research about what happens after we die. So like Jim Tucker is talking about his research with children who remember past lives. I'm talking about all of these different types of after-death communication, spontaneous induced and assisted after-death communication, and its role in grief. Peter Fenwick's there, Larry Dossey and Barbara Dossey. Pim Van Lommel's talking about near-death experiences. So it's sort of going, and the order of the speakers during the conference goes in that order, so you're dying, so someone has died, so you have had experience with someone who has died. And so it goes sort of chronologically, which is just it's just a really unique conference in this unique way that it's laid out. And it's a dogma-free discussion about death, dying, and what may come next.
Awesome. Yeah, I can see where that would be necessary to kind of arm the front line kind of soldiers with the data that they need, the science they need to kind of spread that out. That really sounds great.
For a long time, I've been lamenting that we spend so much effort in our society training pregnant women on what to expect giving birth, and but we don't train people at all about what to expect when they're dying, and training their families about what to expect after someone has died. I have a neighbor and she's always coming to me like, so I heard this story or this happened in my family, whatever. And I just I might as well have a card that I just show to her, like, that's normal. Like, people don't understand how normal these after-death communication experiences are. And it's a shame that anybody can be frightened by them because, again, they demonstrate this continuing bond between you and your deceased person, which is very healing.
Well, hold on. Let me interrupt and
Sure.
speak to that. Let me tee it up a little bit different way. I love what you just said there, but tee it up if someone were to ask you, instead of what to expect when you're expecting, what to expect when you're expecting to die. I mean, what is that? What should that conversation be? What is some of the ideas that your science brings to that conversation? Give us a preview of what you're going to say at this conference.
I'm not qualified at all to talk about that. That's what these healthcare providers speaking at the conference will talk about. What I can talk about is what happens after someone dies, what to expect. The common experience of after-death communication, which happens to about a third of the people of any kind of background, any belief system, any time after the death. That there are all kinds of different things. Sense of presence is really just, I feel like the person is here.
So hold on. So that first point you're making is what to expect after death would be what to expect when someone you love has died. And you're saying, well, a third of the people are going to tell you that they're communicating with that person after they die. So right off the bat, that's a stat that you have to kind of take in and internalize so that if that happens, it shouldn't come as a big surprise, right?
Yeah, and people should expect that that's going to happen, and that's common and normal, and it's not weird, and you're not crazy, and it's not a hallucination, that's really common. And if you had died and people were grieving, that you would want to tell them, like, oh no, look, I'm still right here, it's okay. That's, that just seems like the motivation on the part of the deceased would be. So it makes sense to me that that's a very common experience, and it's unexpected, right? They're spontaneous after death communication. So it's not like people are seeing it everywhere. They're not expecting it, and then it happens, and then they experience it, and it's different. Like, every time someone talks about it in the research that I looked into, like, people were spontaneously bringing up the word hallucination, saying that's not what it is. I know that's not what it was. And so they experience it as very real. And it's this wide variety of experiences. But sense of presence, like I talked about, hearing the person, feeling the person, even seeing things, electronic disturbances, hearing oddly timed music, songs on the radio, natural phenomena, lost things found. All kinds of things that people experience as communication from their deceased loved one that they sort of translate as, the person is still in my life, which is tremendously healing for grief. And so it's such a shame, in my view, that it's not understood how common these things are, and that when they do happen to people, those experiences, that they don't share them, and that they think that they've gone crazy, and they go, oh, they sort of even to themselves say, oh, that couldn't have happened. I must have been dreaming, or no, that really happened to you. And believing that it was real demonstrates that continuing bond, which is sort of the only thing we know that is helpful for grief.
Great. And then final question, I guess, would be, what is the relationship in your mind for your personal journey here in terms of this research, the relationship between the spontaneous afterlife communication and then the assisted or induced? And I'm not quite sure the distinction, but the assisted afterlife communication is what we generally talk about when we talk about a mediumship reading. What has kind of that, I'm not sure what my question is, but what is the link between that and spontaneous after-death communication in terms of your research going forward? Where do you think people need to look in terms of linking those two together?
So spontaneous experiences of after-death communication are what the word means, spontaneous. You didn't expect it, and you're experiencing some form of communication from your deceased loved one. And then induced after-death communication usually takes one of two forms. One is participation in the psychomantium, which is sitting in a dimly lit room, like mirror gazing. It's Raymond Moody was the one who came up with the term.
Raymond Moody, who really has pioneered the whole research into near-death experience, and it's sitting in a dark room with a mirror and just seeing what happens.
Right, and which was studied by Arthur Hastings and his team at ITP, Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which is now Sophia University, in the early 90s. For many years, they studied it. And then the second kind of induced after-death communication is pioneered by Alan Botkin, who was a psychologist who was using a therapeutic protocol called EMDR.
Amazing stuff.
Yeah, and so he found when he did this, when he used this therapeutic with people, if he did it a certain way, that people were experiencing after-death communication, and he sort of honed it and now claims you can do it to anyone and they can have a after-death communication. So those are examples of induced after-death communication, which also have been demonstrated to statistically improve grief. So we have spontaneous, which have been studied by many people and shown an improvement in grief. Induced experiences of after-death communication, same thing, improves grief. Assisted after-death communication is communicating with your deceased loved one through a mediumship reading. And so it only makes sense that should also improve grief. And anecdotally and with exploratory questionnaire data, it looks like it does, but we need to do the work. And so I've designed a clinical trial, and we need to do that clinical trial to demonstrate is what we're hearing anecdotally and we're seeing in exploratory research, is that phenomena real? And if it is, who might be benefiting most? And when might it be contraindicated? Maybe, the next day after someone dies, not the best time for a reading. Like maybe, when we have people participate in our research, we say a year. You need to go through your own natural process of grief before we throw you into this communication with your deceased experience. And so maybe that, we don't know. That's just the way we do it.
We don't know.
Yeah.
And we don't know if for one individual it's a year and for another individual it's 48 hours. We don't know anything.
Exactly. And because the clinical community really doesn't have anything to offer the grieving, we talked about traditional psychotherapy doesn't work with grief, and it shouldn't. It makes sense that it doesn't, because how can psychologists demonstrate continuing bonds with your deceased loved one with you? That doesn't make sense. And you can't use drugs for grief because it's not long term, and it takes a long time for like antidepressants to kick in, and it's not depression. Grief is not depression. It's a natural process. So there's nothing the clinical community can really offer the grieving, but this seems like it really has meat, like it really is possible, because induced and spontaneous ADCs help with grief. It only makes sense that assisted would as well. And so there's this giant hole in, like we were saying, there's this baby boomer population has started to die, and there's just going to be a lot of people grieving in the near future, and we have nothing to offer them. Whereas this is sort of a one-off, get one reading, demonstrate the bond. Now you've redefined your relationship and you can move on with your life, which I think is what the dead want us to do anyway, is not cry about them, is to keep living. That's what we're here for. That's what we're still here to do. Keep living, keep having experiences, and not be stuck in our longing for them.
Awesome. I got about 50 posts I could do out of this, and I'm going to try, because I really think, back to kind of our original kind of pre-interview discussion, I do think there's, I'm just excited about all this whole thing, because I just see so many different ways to kind of chop it up and put it out there and hopefully just draw more attention to it. It's just great work that you're doing, Julie. Certainly wish you the best of luck. Thanks so much for coming on and updating us on everything that you're doing. It's been an absolute joy talking to you as usual.
My pleasure, Alex. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again to Dr. Julie Beischel for joining me today on Skeptiko. One question to tee up for this interview: What do you make of the continuing bonds paradigm that I talked about at the beginning of this show? I see it as another way that science is backing off of materialism without really announcing it. And I think there's a lot of those things going on. But what do you make of it? Are there broader implications, or is this much to do about nothing? So give some thought to that and let me know what you think. The place to do it is at the Skeptiko Forum. Hey, please come back and visit the Skeptiko Forum. Where have you guys been? Come on back. And if you're new, come on over. We have a lot of good conversations going on there, but I'd love to have more. Join us over there. Of course, you can also join me on Facebook. More and more people are, and that's great. We're getting a good number of shares on our shows. I'd love to have even more. Love to expand the community. Share this with as many people as possible, as many people as you think could benefit from it. That's something you can do that helps out if you're so inclined. I've also been getting some great support from people who have suggested guests and have gone ahead and booked some guests for me, or at least made that initial contact. And that's really fantastic. I love to engage with all of you in doing that. And you just have some fantastic selections and are able to get these people to come on the show. So that's great. And if you want to do that, reach out and contact me. Email, again, Facebook, any way you do it is great. Of course, the place to find Skeptiko on the web is at skeptiko.com, or just Google any of the various topics we cover, and we're very searchable. I think you'll find us pretty quickly. So that's going to do it for this episode. Have a lot of stuff coming up, a lot of interviews coming out. I keep doing more and more. I don't know. I'm just going to have to start publishing them more frequently because I can't resist talking to all these great folks. So you'll see more and more in the future, and I hope you're ready for that. But until next time, do take care, and bye for now.